Welcome to From the Mind of Christine McConnell. In today's episode, we are going to be making one of the creepiest things you can, and that is one of those spooky haunted eye paintings where the eyes move. So I did one of these maybe a couple of years ago on Patreon, but I think I have an idea to make it even better. So the very first step is going to be making our own artwork. I'm creating my painting in Photoshop, and it's pretty difficult to take a Photoshop project and convert it to something that's a watchable video. So I actually spent multiple days here trying to come up with something that was not going to make your eyes bleed to watch. And so what I've come up with is basically what you've got here on the left-hand side is the full image. And then if I'm doing something really detailed with the face, we'll just hop over there to the right. This project is a little bit of a fun challenge for me because I've actually never painted something from scratch in Photoshop. Usually if I'm going to just do something like that, I'll paint it in oil in person. And if I am working on something in the computer, it's often composite work where I'm taking multiple images that I've shot, blending them together, and then painting over them. So creating something completely from scratch and hoping that it will look like something good at the end it's going to be a little bit of an experiment. My hope is to create a painting that has kind of a look like maybe it came from the 1800s, so I had to experiment with multiple hairstyles before I finally found something that was not only flattering, but also kind of the period. I've always really liked drawing and painting, and for some reason, I've never given myself much time to actually practice. And honestly, that is what makes great painters and artists, is people who practice at what they do. And so every time I tackle this, it's usually been a few years at least before I've done my last thing. And so it's always kind of fun to sort of get into it and learn as you go, and then also realize that you've gotten either a little bit better or maybe you've even got a little bit rusty in some areas. I'm doing this completely with no reference, which is kind of a dicey thing to do if you want it to look like one of these old period paintings. And so usually those artists would have somebody sit for them. And this is just kind of from scratch. And I just keep tweaking things until they start to look right to me. I really do love the look of actual hand painted things in person, but one incredible advantage that digital has over oils or anything like that is your ability to fix things as they come up, because when you're working with something like oil or acrylic, I may not notice I have a problem until I'm really far in, and then it can take somewhere between hours or days to fix, and in the computer, you can just fix it instantly. Towards the end of this project, I realized that the brushes that I've been using in Photoshop for years needed an upgrade. And so I found these ones by Michael Adamides, and they are just amazing. I should have gotten these a long time ago, and they just make everything go a lot easier. It was right about at this point that I actually started to feel kind of okay about how this was coming out. I had really only given myself 4 days to pull this off, and so up until this point, I had been a little bit apprehensive or nervous, and then finally, right around here, I started to get a little bit excited. And the last thing I want to add is just a little bit of jewelry. Okay, this turned out super neat and I'm so happy with how it looks, but now the most important thing is getting the measurement between the pupils. So this is really, really critical because you want this painting to match up to your face. The way you can do that is using an app called Zenny or any eyeglasses app to measure your pupillary distance between each pupil. If you don't want to do that, you can also just use a ruler. And then once you have that number, just make sure that the actual size of the painting is going to match up to that. The painting is done and I've sent it off to my printer. The printer I've been using for the last 4 years is called Boston Pro Print, and they are just wonderful. If you're looking for a good printer, that's the one to try. And while I'm waiting for that to come back, I'm going to take a quick field trip over to Lowe's. Once I was back home, I started building the canvas that I will be adhering my painting to. The largest piece that I needed to cut, I used 1/4-inch plywood, and once I had the size that I wanted, then I took these 3/4 by 2-inch boards and started cutting them at a diagonal to build a frame around that larger piece. It's always great to use a lot of wood glue when you do a wood project, just because it's like an extra nail that just holds everything together. Oh, let's talk about the size, because obviously when I made the image, I wasn't really paying attention to how large this was going to need to be in order to make sure that the face was going to match the size of my face. So what I ended up with here is a gigantic picture, and I had a frame that I was going to use, but it's just not going to fit, and I don't want to crop down any of this image. So for that reason, I'm going to have to custom make my own frame. For the base of the frame, I'm building a little bit of a box using 2 rods of 3/4 inch by 2 inch, and then on the top is a 4-inch by 3/4 inch. And this is just going to be kind of lightweight, but at the same time give the shape that I need to start building some of my decorative molding on. The funniest thing is I might sound like I know what I'm talking about, but I've never actually built a frame in my life. Most of what I'm doing here I learned earlier this year when I did a coffered ceiling downstairs in the den. And so I was able to actually use some of the scrap wood that I had from that project, in addition to just all of these other things, to sort of put this together, and it worked out beautifully. Once they were put together, I lined it up next to the canvas that I had built, marked the cuts that I was going to need to make, and then took it over to the chop saw. If I'm being completely honest, this was very nerve-wracking because all of this molding was so pricey that once I had it all together and I started making these cuts, you couldn't mess up. So I was like double and triple checking all of my measurements before pulling that blade down. To meld my frame pieces together, I'm using 2 sizes of metal brackets in addition to glue and brad nails. Oh, and always make sure you pre-drill. You would never want this to split. For the painting to work how it's intended, I needed to create a slightly deeper frame, and so I'm just adding these extra wood pieces just to give it a little bit more depth. The method I'm using to hang this frame is going to be something called a French cleat. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to make sure that the painting is super secure on the wall. It's level, and then once it's installed, it's not going to wiggle or move at all. I'm using a bandsaw to cut in half a 4-inch wide board, and I'm cutting it at an angle, and what that creates is a lock and key. So you fuse one side, let's just say the lock on the back of the frame, and then you fuse the key to the wall using very sturdy bolts. And then this gives you a ton of security. Now I just have to fill any little gaps with wood filler, and then I can move on to staining. I'm a really big fan of gel stains just because they are so much less messy than liquid stains. And the color I am using here is mahogany, and it just really reacted beautifully with the wood. Once it was fully stained, I then lacquered it, and then I set it aside to move on to the next part of this project. Okay, I am so jazzed with how this frame came out. It's a beast. It's very, very large, but honestly, the finished result exceeded whatever I expected that I could do. So that's super amazing. And now we get to move on to the most fun part of this project, which is creating the actual haunted painting. I was beyond excited to unfurl this and see how it printed, and it just turned out beautiful. To secure it to my canvas, I'm going to tap in 3 brads along the top, and then I'm going to make sure that it's perfectly aligned how I want it. Once I was happy, I stood it up, took a very fresh blade, and started cutting out the eyes. This part is a little persnickety, and the only parts you're going to want to cut out are the iris and the whites of the eyes. You don't want to cut away the squishy membrane that's on the corners. After they're out, set them aside in a very safe place because you don't want to lose those. And then roll up your painting, and now we can start fusing it to the board with glue. I'm using a wallpaper paste, and I'm avoiding the area exactly where the eyes are going to sit just because I don't want any adhesive bubbling up through there. And then I'm just using a brush to smear around a really thick and generous coat. You'll want to really take your time as you unroll this onto the adhesive just because you don't want any bubbles or imperfections sort of popping through. I watched so many Baumgartner restoration videos on YouTube that this is such a fun thing to do because I've learned so many techniques just from watching him attach canvases to their frames. I definitely don't have the same finesse that Julian does with a baby hammer, but I do get the job done. Now for the terrifying part. I'm going to take my Dremel and cut out those eye cavities and you have to get it perfectly around. You don't want any exposed wood, so you have to get right up to the canvas. Okay, so I knew this could happen. Dremels sometimes like to get away from you, and I've marred my image just a little tiny bit above the eye. Luckily, this is a super simple fix. All I have to do is mix some acrylic paints, and that should mend this little error. The next step is to take a small sheet of that 1/4 inch thick plywood, tape it to the back, and on the opposite side, just take a pencil and mark out the exact size of those holes. I'm sure there's a cleaner way to have done this, but I was kind of in a hurry and my Dremel was already set up, so I just started cutting it out this way. And then once they were fully out, I used a belt sander to just gently ebb away all of the little edges. It took a little bit of finessing, but once I got them to fit perfectly, then I was able to take a block on the opposite side. I used a level just to make sure it was going to be perfect, marked it with a pencil, then I taped it down, and then on the opposite side, I started to mix some Gorilla Glue epoxy, which is a 2-part, and then from here, I'm just going to paint a little bit of this on to each of these little nuggets and then glue them into place. You only want to use a tiny little bit of this epoxy because you don't want it to push out and fuse itself to your painting. The removable block is looking really great, and now to get it to stick, I'm going to drill out some cavities and install some magnets. I don't want these magnets to touch each other exactly because that could make a clacking noise that might alert the person on the other side of the picture. So I'm digging out my little cavities just a little bit thicker than I need to. And then this way there's just a tiny bit of a gap to avoid any sound being generated. I'm using my Dremel here again just to cut out a few grooves on this inner side, and this will work as a bit of a handle so your fingers have something to grab from the opposite side. To lock the magnets into place, I'm again mixing that Gorilla Glue 2-part epoxy, and again just adding a tiny dab on the end of the magnet and pressing it into place. Now it's time to fuse the opposite magnets to the actual picture. And the way that I'm doing this is I'm filling up those cavities where the magnets go, just so that they retain that gap. And now I'm pushing in that top magnet until it's perfectly flush with the board, making sure it's going to line up just how it should, and then mixing just a little bit more of that epoxy and getting it into place. And now I'm just going to leave this alone for a moment so it can set. This turned out perfect and exactly how it was supposed to. And now all I need to do is just tap out that sawdust. I wanted to create a way for this to attach to the frame so that, for one, obviously it never gets lost, and then also something to give it kind of an old-fashioned look. And so how I'm doing this is I'm drilling a couple holes in the corners of the block as well as a little area of the frame. And now I'm going to weave through some twine, give myself a good amount of length, and do a little bit of decorative braiding. Once I had about a foot left over of my twine, I wove half of my threads through the block and then started combining them back on itself and continuing the braid going backwards. To avoid an unsightly end to the braid, I just started snipping a little strand here and there at different heights, and I would just tuck that little end in until it disappeared. I'm so excited we're almost done. Now to reattach our canvas eyes, I'm taking a gel super glue, painting it directly onto our block, and then gently tucking the eyes back to where they were cut out. I have slightly deep set eyes and I want my face to get as close to this canvas as possible. So I'm just taking out my Dremel and clearing away a few of the areas where my face might hit before my eyes do. The painting is ready to go, and now it's time to get it into the frame. To lock the canvas into place, I'm just using a little nugget of wood as well as a metal plate, and I'm just going to do this twice on each side as well as the corners. In preparation for hanging, I've measured out my cleat and I'm just pre-drilling it before we go downstairs. Making sure your cleat is perfectly level is really critical because this will determine exactly how your picture hangs. This is a solid brick wall, so I am pre-drilling really thoroughly and installing a masonry plug that I'll be able to screw right into, and that will lock this cleat in place. I've created a second episode on Patreon that features how I tunneled through this wall and made a trick medicine cabinet so that nobody knows what's going on. And so if you're interested in checking that out, follow the link below. Now, our very last step that we need to do is to install some lights on the back of the painting. And what this will do is it's going to light up your eyes and get them to match the outside of the image so that when people are looking at it, they can clearly see those eyes moving back and forth. This is definitely a step they never covered in Scooby-Doo, and it is really critical. Otherwise, your eyes will just be black little holes and you won't be able to make out anything. So I'm using some LED flex strip on the back side, and I'm taping a strip to the top and the bottom so that your eyes are surrounded by light when you're looking through. I've got this set up on a switch, so all you'll need to do is open the cabinet, push a button, and you'll be ready to go. You'll want to have somewhere to place the block when you are using this apparatus. So I'm pre-drilling out the side as well as the block itself, and I'm just gluing magnets into both. And so when you're using it, all you need to do is pull the block away from the face and pop it over here to the side. It is all finished, and oh my God, I love it so much. It might be one of my most favorite things ever. I would give anything to be a fly on the wall in 100 years and just watch somebody accidentally stumble upon this. So I hope you've enjoyed this. If you are interested in seeing a bunch of more episodes, head on over to Patreon. We do videos, live streams, all sorts of fun stuff over there. So until next time, take care of yourselves and have a very happy Halloween.